Hey everyone, I'm Mnar Muhawesh for MintPress News' Behind the Headline. Sadly, the world continues to be overrun with military occupation and war and beset by the effects of modern-day colonialism. But nowhere are these issues more apparent than in occupied Palestine, particularly in the Gaza Strip. Human rights activists captured Israel's appalling human rights abuses that took place there last summer under Operation Protective Edge. And for the first time in a long time, the Palestinian plight garnered international headlines because it could no longer be ignored, thanks to cameras and social media. But these atrocities, of course, are nothing new. 12 years ago, another tragedy was caught on camera the moment a peace activist met her own grisly end when she came up against the Goliath of Israeli occupation itself. Rachel Corrie has become a symbol of Palestinian resistance since 2003. The year the 23-year-old American peace activist was crushed to death by an Israeli bulldozer while non-violently blocking a Palestinian family's home from being demolished. She made herself known, of course, by wearing an orange hazmat suit. The driver of the bulldozer even communicated with her, but that didn't stop him from crushing her to death, with the horrifying incident all caught on camera. 12 years have passed since that tragedy, 12 years which have been marked by a lengthy legal battle and repeated calls for an investigation into her death by activists, her parents, and even the Bush and Obama administrations. For the past 12 years, Israeli courts have attempted to shift the blame onto Rachel Corrie herself. And on February 12th of this year, the Israeli Supreme Court upheld a lower court's ruling that Rachel was killed in a war activity, for which the state bears no liability under Israeli law. That's right, folks. They investigated themselves and found that they had done nothing wrong. Something that sounds all too familiar. Rachel's parents, Craig and Cindy Corrie, who run the Rachel Corrie Foundation, recently joined me to talk about their uphill battle to find justice for their daughter's death. And I began by asking them why Rachel chose to go to the war-torn Gaza Strip in the first place. Take a look.
So she had this love of nature, and I think also a love of people. And more than any other person that I think I know, she refused to look away from marginalized people. So as a 12-year-old, she wrote what I think is a very good poem about the homeless in Olympia and how we would empathize with the homeless if they were at a distance, but we didn't want to be close enough to smell their breath, and we wanted to put $1, so we did, give them $1, so we didn't really have to look at them. She worked as when she was in high school, and then certainly in college, she worked for money with mentally ill, and so working in a halfway house so that people didn't have to be in the hospital. And she wrote about that. So in some ways, when she went to Gaza, which seems to me a lot like a marginalized place, and then down to Rafah, which is marginalized within Gaza, it just seemed to me an extension of what she very consciously, I think naturally but consciously tried to do, which is not look away from people, but come into contact with where they are.
And I understand the court ruling was announced in February, but what was actually the first response that you received from the Israeli court when you first found out what had happened to Rachel?
So there's a statute of limitations in Israeli courts that after 2 years, if something's happened in the occupied territories, you can't go into Israeli courts. So we gave 2 years to the U.S. government to try to find answers to what happened to Rachel. So when something like this happens, I think a number of things, of course, go through your mind, and it's hard to remember everything that you're feeling because it's so emotional. But one of them is you just wonder, how could this happen?
Right.
And so that was one thing. How could it happen? And then some sort of accountability if it isn't simply an accident. I think the other thing is you want to make sure it doesn't happen to anybody else if there's anything you can do about that. But we tried to work through the U.S. government to have, through diplomatic means, find out what happened. And indeed, President Bush was promised by Prime Minister Sharon a thorough, credible, and transparent investigation And it remains the view of our government, not just our family, but our government, that that never happened in Rachel's case. So after 2 years, the only process that we had as a family is a civil lawsuit, and we took that to Israeli courts because it seemed like that was a place where we might, through discovery, find out more and be able to compel witnesses to come into court. So we did file the suit, and that would have been in 2005, and we finally went to court in 2010. The first day of testimony was March 10th, 2010. The last day of testimony was July 10th of 2011. And this was in district court. The courts there only have a judge, so there's no jury. And so the judge has many things that he's listening to, and he'll have a day in court here and another day there. And so that gets really strung out, which is difficult if you're coming from the United States to each of those days in court, as we did. The district court came out with its verdict, which was entirely that it was Rachel's fault. There was no fault of the Israeli military. The judge said that the investigation was exemplary. It was great, and that verdict was given in August of 2011, and we appealed that to the High Court. And that was heard in late May of last year, and we finally got the opinion of the High Court. And basically, it's dismissed, which sounds a little funny because we had all the testimony went on, and the U.S. court would be dismissed at the beginning. But it was dismissed, and what the High Court said was that Rachel was killed as an act of war, and that as an act of war, you could not hold Israel responsible for that. And they cited that under their opinion, Israeli law took precedence over international law, so that under international law we might be able to sue, but we could not in Israel be able to do that. So that's an extremely troubling sort of verdict, because it really means that no matter what goes on in the occupied territories, there's no question about it from anybody. So in Rachel's case, she was considered by the U.S. government as a human rights observer. You can kill a human rights observer, you can kill a UN worker, you can kill a reporter, and of course we know that they continue to kill Palestinian civilians, even children, year after year. So that has to be fought, but I don't know if we can do that in the courts anymore.
You know, having said all this, what precedent do you think that this sets for activists and journalists who are trying to document Israel's crimes but are being blocked from the Gaza Strip?
It's a very dangerous precedent. Human Rights Watch came out after the High Court issued their decision and used those words, said that this was a very dangerous decision. And not only for people like Rachel or Craig and me or you who might want to go to Gaza or to the West Bank to see people and to see firsthand what's happening, but also for Israeli soldiers. And Human Rights Watch put out that what the decision does is, once again, give license to these soldiers to do most anything, and to know that their court system will prevent them from being held accountable. Certainly the military has done that all along, but now we have the courts speaking to support that as well. And the issue with that, of course, is that those soldiers, and we've seen a lot of Israeli soldiers, we were in Israel, living there off and on, not consecutively, but for about 9 months while the trial proceedings were going on, because they took such a long time. And in many ways, that was a great opportunity, because we got to really connect with Palestinian Israelis and also Jewish Israelis. But we saw those young soldiers. These are 18 to 20, 21, 22-year-old kids, many of them. And they have to live with what they do in Gaza or in the West Bank. And there are organizations like Breaking the Silence, where they come out and talk about, where they are able to share some of what has happened during their terms of service. And you can tell from reading those reports how really troubling that is for a lifetime. Of course, for Palestinians and for reporters, as you asked about, it first of all, it completely disregards international law and the obligation that a military has to protect citizens and civilians in areas of conflict, areas of hostility, even during war actions. So it's very, very troubling that the Israeli High Court would say that in their case, their law supersedes international law. And they've even gone so far with Gaza now to say that it doesn't even have to be like determined that they're in an area of hostility just because it's in Gaza. There's no ability for people to bring actions against the military in the state of Israel. I'd point out too that when Rachel was killed, we have testimony from soldiers who were on the ground that day and from the high command that the activists posed no threat. They posed no threat to the soldiers at all. And yet, the people on the ground, they had asked to stop the action because they knew it was dangerous. The company commander had, but was directed not to let the internationals interfere with their work and to continue. So, again, it was all right to proceed in this under dangerous circumstances and to proceed and to disregard the responsibility that we feel they had to make sure that the civilians in the area were protected.
As Palestinians take their case to the International Criminal Court for Israel's atrocities they committed last summer under Operation Protective Edge, and as the media continues to paint this as an equal level playing field, as a religious war between Muslims and Jews, which we both, we all know that it's not like that. What do you want people to know about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict coming from an American family who found themselves in the crossfires of this conflict?
It's a long story with us, but I think I'm thinking when you said that of a friend of ours, Yitzhak Frankenthal, and his son was in the Israeli Defense Force. He's Orthodox Jew, Israeli, and his son came home from the army on a weekend. He said, "Dad, if I was a Palestinian, I'd kill all the Israelis I could." And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Dad, we're taking their land. We're taking their land." And tragically, his son then was captured by Hamas and murdered shortly after that. Yitzhak went out, he went to Rabin, who was the prime minister at the time, and said, "It's this occupation that killed my son." And Rabin said, "You won't find another family in all of Israel that suffered what you have," and agrees with you. And he said, "I came back in a week with 10 of them. He founded the Bereaved Families Forum, and it's now about 500 families strong. It's both Israelis and Palestinians, all of whom have lost somebody in the war. So I think that's one of the first messages. It's about the taking of a land, and ethnic cleansing is probably the kindest thing you could say about it. It really is. I try to say, and I try to hold in my heart, that I'm not against Israel, but I am against apartheid. And Rachel was killed as a part of apartheid, and it's a particularly brutal apartheid that's being inflicted on the Palestinian people. That needs to end. Also, I think that when you talk about human rights, they're everywhere. We all drink from the same well there. So they're my rights that are being attacked over in Palestine. And if I think that, well, okay, it's not really going to happen to a white American male, then I'm talking about privilege, which is a much more, it's a much baser metal than a human right. So I think right now, the Palestine is a litmus test for human rights around the world, much like South Africa used to be. And I think as we try to attack the apartheid that we see in Israel, that we're actually helping Israel, just as attacking the apartheid in South Africa ended up helping South Africa. White South Africans didn't think so at the time, but they're a whole lot better off now than they would have been had that continued to run the old course.
Well, Cindy and Craig, thank you again for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time to answer these questions, and I do hope that you will find real justice for what happened to your daughter. Thank you again for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.